Welcome back. We just got done setting up MySQL Workbench. We ran some of the commands through MySQL Terminal and then ran it through MySQL Workbench. We can see MySQL Workbench is a lot easier to use and has some extra functionality that makes programming in SQL much easier. So we're going to start from MySQL Workbench. The last video we saw why our current table was not very good. We're going to create a new table. This time we're going to call it food stock with a lowercase s. Okay, so this is our second food stock table. And we're going to define some constraints, some rules. So in this case, we're still going to have an ID. It's going to be an int, but we're going to make it our primary key. And we don't want to have to define this value. So we're going to let the database auto-increment, which is a keyword. It's going to auto-increment our ID. So when I insert the first record, the ID may be 1. And I insert another one, it'll be 2, 3, 4, 5. And it'll just keep auto-incrementing. So we don't have to specify the ID. The ID will automatically be inserted. The ID will automatically be created when I insert a record using the auto-increment feature. But what's a primary key? So if I come over here, search for MySQL primary key, okay, we can see what a primary key is. Now there's some nice features for a primary key. So a primary key is a column or an attribute. It could also be a set of columns that uniquely identifies each row in the table. Usually you want to be able to select one element. I can select many elements by using another feature or another attribute, but I want one attribute that I could use to select a unique item, and that's going to be our primary key. So you must follow the rules below if you want to define a primary key. 1, a primary key must contain unique values, and that's exactly why I set up auto-increment. I don't want to have to worry about whether that ID has already been used or not. So if I do auto-increment, it'll ensure that the primary key has unique values. Okay, so if a primary key consists of multiple columns, the combination of values in these columns must be unique. A primary key column cannot contain null values. Okay, so once I select primary key and I do a describe the table, you'll see null is not allowed. So I have to declare the primary key column with a not null attribute. If you don't, MySQL will force the primary key column is not null implicitly. Okay, so as soon as I put primary key on this attribute, it's going to ensure that the ID is unique. That way I can select one item from the table, and it's going to make sure the ID is not null. If I use auto-increment, auto-increment will take care of both of these constraints. Last but not least, a table can only have one primary key. Okay, since MySQL works faster with integers, the data type of the primary key column should be integer or big int. However, you should make sure that the value ranges of the integer type for the primary key is sufficient for storing all possible rows the table may have. The primary key column also has the auto-increment attribute that generates a unique sequence for the key automatically. The primary key of the next row is greater than the previous one. So what's also nice about auto-increment is it helps us keep track of the time. When was this row inserted? ID equal to 1 was inserted before ID equal to 2. So here's a good way to set up the ID field for a table. Now let's continue. Name was a varchar of 50, which is good. But let's say we want name to be not null, so they have to specify a name, and I want it to be unique. Now remember, there's two ways to enter strings in MySQL. I do varchar, I could also do text. If I do text, I cannot check for unique because the text will be different links. But if I do varchar 50, every name is 50 characters, so I can check for uniqueness. So I'm putting constraints on the name attribute. I can also put constraints on the quantity. Okay, so I have my quantity field. It's going to be an int. But now quantity will not be negative. So if I do an int, it's going to be from negative to positive. It's going to allow negative integers and positive integers. But quantity, you can't get less than 0. I can't have -1 sushi. So I can do what's called unsigned, which will ensure it's only a positive integer, which will allow for more values. If I don't have to worry about negative values, only worry about positive, I can increase the number of integers I can store. And we're also going to make sure it's not null. Lastly was cost, which is a float. Cost cannot be negative, so we'll also do unsigned, which allows for the range to be larger. And we're going to make sure it's also not null. And we're going to create this table. So you see here, I'm creating the table. I put some constraints. This will ensure that the data coming into the table is inserted correctly and follows some rules. This is what's nice about a relational table. With a relational table, I can define these constraints. So I'll run this command, make sure it works. I created food stock, so if I do a show tables, you should be able to see 2 tables now. Capital S is our old food stock. Now let's say I do an insert. So I'm going to insert into the new table. Now when I do an insert, I don't have to specify ID anymore because ID is auto-incremented. But if I don't specify ID, I must specify the attributes. So now I specify the attributes and then the values. So I can insert King's Hawaiian bread, I can insert jiazi, I can insert bazi, which is good Chinese food. I can also insert dim sum and herbs. Okay. Now if I do a select star from food stock, okay, we can see all the data we inserted. Okay, so I have all this data. You'll see the IDs auto-incremented. It's a primary key. So if I try to insert multiple records with the same ID, it's not going to let me. Okay, it's going to block that. So we see I can do a select star. I can also select specific attributes. So maybe I only want to select the name, or maybe I only want to select name and quantity. So I can put the attributes there separated by a comma. I also have what's called a where clause. So maybe I want to select name and quantity from food stock, but I don't want to select all of them. I only want to select where cost is greater than 10. So we see here there's only 2. Well, that's quantity here. So let me do a select star. Select star. Cost greater than 10. There's 1, 2, 3. So if I do where cost is greater than 10, you'll see I pulled back 3 elements. Okay, so I can also do what's called a where clause. Now it's important to note the order. You always put the select statement and then the from and then the where. Okay, you must follow these rules. If I mix these up, put the where clause first, the command won't run. So I always do a select and then either select star, select specific attributes, from, and then I put which table, and then I always put the where clause. Now I can say select where cost is greater than 10, which is going to pull back a range of elements, or I could use my ID. I can select specific records. Now, if I do that, so let's say I do a select here, select name and quantity from food stock, where ID is equal to 1. Okay, I'm using the primary key. Primary key must be unique. You'll see it, notice a syntax error because I misspelled from. So if I spell from correctly, the error goes away. I can run this command. You'll see it returns back just 1 element. Now this is good, especially if I want to update the table. I don't want to update everything in food stock. Maybe I only want to update 1 element. So if I do a select star from food stock, and let's say the price of my King's Hawaiian bread, let's say it's popular, price stays the same, but the quantity goes up. So I buy more King's Hawaiian bread. So I can update this table. I'm going to set the quantity attribute equal to 20 where ID is equal to 1. If I got rid of this where clause, it's going to update the entire table. So whenever you do an update, you always want to make sure you have the where clause, and you either want to update a range or you want to only update one item. So if I do this, you'll see it updates. So if I do a select star, you'll see now it went from 12 to 20. And you'll see this is now editable. If I double click, I can also edit this in manually, okay, which is another good thing about MySQL Workbench. So let's see, let me put this back. So when I do an update, make sure you only update a range. And what's nice about MySQL Workbench is if I take this where clause off and try to run it, it's not going to let me. MySQL Workbench protects me. It says you are using safe update mode and you tried to update a table without a where clause that uses a key column. If you want to disable this, which is not recommended, you can. But MySQL Workbench would protect you, because if I did this, all my data is gone. Okay, all my data is gone, and I just overrided all my values. So I can do where ID is equal to 1 and only update a very specific row. Okay, which is nice about MySQL Workbench. We can also do a describe. So if I do describe, we saw that earlier. If I do describe food stock or DESC, it's the same. Okay, so I'll do describe food stock. It shows the key features for that table. ID is an int. It does not allow null. It's the primary key, and it auto increments. Name is a varchar, does not allow null values, and it's unique. I do DESC, it's a shorthand for describe, so it's the same thing. Sometimes you need to change the table after you've created it. So I can also do an alter. If I do alter table food stock, I'm going to add this column. It's going to be type date time, and the default is null. So if I run this and now do a describe food stock, you'll see purchase date is also available, and it does allow null values. Okay, so if I describe food stock, you'll see I changed it. So now I can update. I can update food stock. I'm going to set quantity equal to 30, and you'll see a comma is and purchase date equal to now the current time of the server, where ID is equal to 1. So if I run this, I'm doing an update, so I have to have a where clause. And if I do another select to see if it worked, you'll see quantity is now 30, and I have a purchase date and time. Okay, it's the time of the server. So we may want to change the time of the server to match the current time zone, which we'll do in 4830. But we'll see that that command worked. Same with delete. If I do delete from food stock, it's going to delete all the data. So when I do a delete, MySQL Workbench also requires a where clause. So if I want to delete a row from the table, make sure you specify which row you want to delete. So I'll run this and then do a select star to see if it worked. You'll see I was able to delete ID 2. If I do a show tables, you'll see I have 2 tables. I can also delete the first one. So if I do drop table, it's going to delete our first table. If I show tables again, okay, you'll see that food stock, the first one's deleted. Okay. If I try to select from the first table, you'll see I get an error message. It says food stock with a capital S does not exist. Now, we're going to be accessing this database from PHP. So it's very important to create a user that's not the root user and set a password for it. In the next video, we'll create this MySQL database user and set the password for it so we can access it using PHP. We'll see you in the next video.